A British student's life sentence for spying in the United Arab Emirates. As friends of Matthew Hedges, his university and government leaders in London all protest his innocence. Is it all a major misunderstanding or evidence of a larger problem of academic and political freedom in the Emirates? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Matthew Hedges has spent the last 7 months in prison in the UAE. Now he faces the prospect of staying there forever. The university postgraduate student was given a life sentence on Wednesday for spying. The Emiratis say he made a full confession. His family says the document he signed was in Arabic and he didn't understand it. Government leaders in Abu Dhabi say they're considering a request from his wife for clemency.
Like the UK, the UAE is a country with an independent judiciary. The government does not dictate verdicts to the court. Matthew Hedges was not convicted after a 5-minute show trial, as some have reported. Over the course of 1 month, 3 judges evaluated compelling evidence in 3 hearings. They reached their conclusion after a full and proper process. This was an extremely serious case. We live in a dangerous neighborhood and national security must be a top priority. This was also an unusual case. Many researchers visit the UAE freely every year without breaking our laws. Under UAE law, everyone has the right to appeal after conviction, and everyone can request a pardon from our president. Mr. Hedges' family have made a request for clemency, and the government is studying that request.
Well, Hedges is a student at Durham University in northern England. He flew to the Emirates to research the UAE's security policies after the Arab Spring. Paul Brennan has more from London on the government response.
They called the ambassador in to the Foreign Office in London on Thursday evening. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, then tweeted on social media after that meeting. He said that I believe and trust that the Foreign Minister is working hard to resolve the situation ASAP. And Daniela Tejada, who is Matthew Hedges' wife, also had a meeting at the Foreign Office on Thursday afternoon in which she softened her criticism, her earlier criticism, and said that she too believed that the diplomatic wheels really were turning now. And that appears to be the glimmer of hope moving forward. A face-saving exercise appears to be taking shape where the UAE say that under its strict laws, Matthew Hedges was guilty as charged, but at the same time, they probably will accept that he was not having any malicious intent. He certainly was not a spy. In the words of Daniela Tejada, who gave a very brief statement after that ambassador statement on Friday morning, she said, "We will wait and see." Paul Brennan, Inside Story.
Well, Matthew Hedges' wife, Daniela, has been describing the scene in court on Wednesday when his brief hearing ended in a life sentence.
Seeing him shaken in court after being handed a life sentence and then being made to leave was beyond heartbreaking. We didn't even get to say goodbye. I really appreciate the Foreign Secretary taking the time to meet me at this crucial point in my and Matt's life. He has assured me that he and his team are doing everything in their power to get Matt free and return him home to me. This is not a fight I can win alone, and I thank the Foreign Office and the British public for now standing up for one of their citizens.
Well, Hedges' story highlights an issue that has arisen repeatedly in different forms. On one side, what some see as the Emirates' narrow and conservative approach to security and public morality. Set against that, the open, modern and tolerant image that the UAE generally, and Dubai in particular, seeks to project to the wider world. Well, let's bring in our guests now. And joining me here in the studio, Mark Owen Jones, Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. He was formerly at Exeter University and is a friend of Matthew Hedges. In London, Glenmore Trenor-Harvey is an intelligence analyst and writes on security issues. And joining us from Kuala Lumpur via Skype, Radha Stirling, founder and CEO of Detained in Dubai. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mark, we're talking here about a 31-year-old student on a 2-week research trip. What was Matthew Hedges doing in the UAE?
Matthew Hedges, like many PhD students, was taking a short trip away from Durham University to conduct interviews, and this is a very common practice amongst PhD students doing political science or security studies. He would have had ethical approval from Durham University to carry out this trip, and within that process is the determination that what Matthew is doing is kosher and above board, and above all things, safe and secure. So that's what Matthew would have been doing, arranging interviews with key people who would have been able to answer his approved research questions.
What were his research questions? What was the nature of the research specifically?
Well, as with many PhDs and as PhD students will know, the questions start off broad. So overall, he was looking at the impact of the Arab Spring on UAE and UAE security policy in particular. And this would not be an unusual topic given the circumstances. In fact, there's many people looking at the security and many people are looking at Arabian Gulf countries and how they have reacted to the Arab Spring. It's very conventional. So we would have been looking at changes in policy, how the UAE, for example, might be safeguarding against similar events that happened in Bahrain happening in the UAE. Not unusual and not controversial. Depending on the nature of access, there could be sensitive issues discussed, but those issues would have been discussed, and as I said before, they would have been approved by the Ethics Committee at Durham University.
OK. Glenmore, why would the UAE be concerned when it comes to this sort of research? I mean, how sensitive is it?
So, I mean, it is the security of the country itself. And I think that, if anything, Hedges suffered from being too good. He knows the Emirates, he had lived there, he had worked there. His area of specialization, this isn't economic research that he is doing, he is actually asking about the most sensitive part of a country's defense mechanism. And I think that because he is obviously a very bright fellow, the nature of his questions were far too penetrating. The Emirates themselves, at the start of this year, decided to revamp, to upgrade their intelligence. And the nature of the conflict or dispute currently with Qatar, together with the Saudis, makes anything about the nature of their operation very, very concerning. And obviously, they don't know whether the Iranians have some influence over them. You have to see it from their point of view. And quite frankly, when people are asking the sort of penetrating questions that he did, in Emirate terms, those are the sort of things that a spy would do.
Right. Radha, just give us an idea of how strict the UAE's national security laws are, especially if Glenmore says that they have been upgraded. How might he have stepped over the line and broken a law if he was simply asking questions that had been cleared by his university on a research trip?
From what we've seen over the past few years is the UAE has increased their clampdown on essentially anything that could be seen as defamatory to the government. So if his research was in fact going to disclose any information that the UAE would consider defamatory, he would be subject to arrest. They've been extremely sensitive in other cases, and just 2 years ago they arrested 2 British men accused of spying also. They were plane spotters and they were hobbyists taking photos of an airport in the UAE. They were held again for at least 4 months before being finally released. The UAE has been arresting anyone, lawyers, activists, human rights individuals and jailing them essentially for saying anything that could be considered negative. So this may not even come down to a security issue so much as they don't appreciate any research that is defaming the country. OK, I mean, Mark, would Matthew not have been fully aware of this, given that he has been in and out of the country since he was 9 years old, and indeed knowing full well about the current climate?
Well, I think there's 2 sides to this. I think Matthew would have been very aware of any sensitivities to his research, but at the same time, having grown up there, or having spent a lot of his life there with his family, he would have also felt familiar and relatively comfortable doing what he was doing. Because according to Matthew, it's clear that he loves the UAE very much. And it wasn't in his nature to criticize the UAE necessarily. And if he did, it was usually fair criticism. So I think he would even be surprised at the response that this has created. And I think what's really important to bear in mind, whilst I take on board what Glenmore was saying, and I don't doubt that Matthew's questions would have been penetrating and incisive, what the problem is when you have a situation as we've seen now in the UAE, post-Arab uprisings, they're at war in Yemen. Oh, naturally, they're going to be more paranoid and suspicious. But what you see when you have a broadening of laws, security laws, as Radha mentioned, and in general, anti-terror laws, these do not discriminate based on someone asking very particular and discreet and incisive questions. The whole nature of anti-terror laws is to broaden the breadth of law and its application to broader crimes. So Radha mentioned the people who were jailed for plane spotting. So there is a tendency when countries become paranoid and revamp their anti-terror laws to cast a wider net in anything that they deem suspicious. So I think this is the fundamental of the problem, is that the state has become more paranoid and the laws have subsequently become more broad and are applied more readily.
OK. Glenmore, the UAE argues that there was a free and transparent trial and indeed that they have compelling evidence proving their case. They say that there was espionage material found on a laptop. I mean, what might that look like?
As I say, it could be, for example, as part of the revamp of the Emirates service, that he had asked about, well, who are you recruiting? Who are getting new people? As I understand it, the Emirates have been recruiting from one particular tribe. Now, if he has knowledge of that, when you start asking these questions, the people you ask the questions of suddenly say, gosh, you know, this is very sensitive. How does he know about that? I go back, I think probably it is the nature of his thoroughness, his diligence has upset the security service, because the people who have placed these charges, I would suggest, are possibly not as bright as Hedges, that they suddenly say, well, how does this chap know all of these questions to ask? So he would be very diligent in keeping his notes. Where would he keep his notes? He would keep his notes on his laptop. So ergo, when they look at his laptop, they see these answers and think, heavens, he really does know a great deal about our strategy. He knows what relationship the Emirates have with the Saudi intelligence services, and they're a pretty rum lot at the moment. So the combination is fairly secure. One of the things that the description is of him as a spy, and there have been several commentators say, well, he's a British spy. Does he work for the British intelligence services? Absolutely not. You know, that you could not imagine a British intelligence officer behaving in the fashion that he has.
Just give us an idea of whether MI6, the British Intelligence Service, would ever consider using an academic to do spy work in somewhere like the UAE that it has good relations with. No. First and foremost, any intelligence gathering that Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, do is far more subtle. An awful lot of it would be through electronic surveillance, monitoring the digital signatures of material coming out of both friends and hostile people. And at the moment, the need to know precisely what is happening in regard to the conflict in the Yemen, the continuing dispute with Qatar, is the sort of information that we want. Now, it seems to me that he was absolutely overt in both the people that he went to meet with, the questions that he was asking. Now, had he just completed his studies, come back, written his doctoral thesis,
then maybe, not just maybe, a number of intelligence services would like to see a copy of that published paper, because he is quite literally looking at the Emirates' security strategy.
Radha, I'll come to you in just a moment just to talk about the jail and the trial conditions. But first of all, Mark, I just want to get an idea of how common it might be for the members of the intelligence service, the British government, to want a debrief from someone working in the region in the area of academics.
I mean, I think there's somewhat of a contradiction in saying that it would be unusual for Britain to, say, spy on an ally like the UAE, but also say that intelligence officers would be very interested in finding out what information someone like Matthew Hedges have. So I do think they would be interested, because there is a lot going on now, obviously, with regards to not just the UAE and Yemen and Qatar, but also, you know, potential commercial deals that might be happening in the UAE, which might be of interest, for example, to British companies. So I think there is always that interest in what is going on. Again, I think it would be rather, it's obviously absurd to suggest that Matthew was working overtly for the intelligence services. For one, you don't just go around asking questions on sensitive nature and have a very poor cover story as Matthew did.
Have you found any red lines when you've been conducting your field research in this region?
Well, I mean, I think, for me, this is a familiar territory. But usually the procedures somewhat differ. So I myself cannot go back to Bahrain. It's somewhere I grew up in and where I've done most of my research on. We know that the UAE has previously banned entry to academics before, such as Dr. Christian Ulrichsen, who's now at Rice University. So what is very common, if people are thought to be critical of the UAE, or maybe even discussing the UAE and sensitive information about the UAE, they tend not to let them in, or elsewhere in the Gulf it's the same, as would happen with Christian, as happened with myself. So I think it's very interesting that they've decided to actually arrest Matthew, hold him in solitary confinement. I think that's unprecedented. I mean, as we've seen other people being arrested for crimes against sort of morality, and in some cases spying. But I think this is a step change in what the UAE are doing, especially towards a foreign national.
And that's where I want to bring Radha back into the conversation, because we know that he's been held for around about 7 months, as Mark said, in solitary confinement for some of that period. His family has even said that he has been given a regular cocktail of drugs whilst in jail. I just want to get an idea from you if these are the sorts of stories and conditions that you've heard before about jails in the UAE.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've dealt with in excess of 10,000 cases over the past decade. What we see about this case is it's not really unusual, except that it's very high profile and extremely risky for diplomatic relations and also the private sector and the academic community. It's certainly sending a clear message. But over the past 10 years, we have seen numerous examples of arbitrary arrests, arrests on the basis of suspicion or hearsay, one person's word, with absolutely zero evidence. And we've seen the UAE authorities not even following their own constitution, their own legal process, their own statutes. And that means that they shouldn't be holding people for in excess of 1 year, for example, as they have done many times before to British nationals, without even charging them, without giving them due process. Matthew Hedges has already been there for many months and now has only received a judgment today, again, after 5 minutes, which is not unusual. Most trials are lasting anywhere between sort of 5 and 15 minutes, and this is obviously an unacceptable duration for anyone to stand a chance at proving their innocence. The United Kingdom will not extradite anyone to the UAE based on the true risk of unfair trials, discrimination, corruption in the legal system, human rights violations, and even torture. So if the UK doesn't trust their legal system to extradite criminals or even people that they believe to be guilty, then obviously there's a problem with the UAE system.
OK, I mean, of course, the UAE, just to jump in there for a moment, because, of course, the UAE insists that it has followed the legal system to the letter, and it's now at the point where the family has asked for clemency, which, again, it says is within the judicial system, and that this is something that the UAE is now considering at the highest level. Is that also common procedure?
It is common procedure. It's become more common in the past 6 to 12 months for the UAE to make an allegation against someone, and in times past, when there was a diplomatic incident like this, the rulers would step in and release that person and almost apologise for having detained them without evidence in the first place. Now what we're seeing is a different pattern where they would prefer to convict that person, say that they have evidence against that person, and then offer them a pardon so that the UAE looks better in front of the international media and the evidence that they apparently had is not contested. And in this case, the UAE has said that they have a signed confession. In our experience, forced confessions are the norm in the UAE, and confessions are signed in Arabic without a translator, so we can't take them seriously either.
Glenmore, there is something of a very blurry red line here, isn't there? I mean, on the one hand, we've got the Emirates painting itself as an open, free society that warmly welcomes all foreigners, Westerners, and yet we're frequently hearing of foreigners being locked up for various different offences. How difficult is it to know when one has stepped over the line?
Well, exceedingly so. The thing that I've been thinking about is a journalist. By definition, you go and ask questions, and if the answer you get is, not satisfactory, you probe further. That often results in the person who's being questioned taking offence, and if he is a national or an official of that country, it is quite easy to take umbrage and to convert that umbrage into some sort of allegation. And the thing is that any journalist or any businessman going into a market will ask questions. They will conduct due diligence. They will want to find out. And as I say, I think in the case of Hedges, dealing in the most sensitive of areas, the security strategy of a country who, as a country, feel that they are currently under threat because of their engagement in Yemen and because of the conflict they have with Qatar, he, in a sense, is just too good at his job.
Mark, this is a warning, isn't it, to academics? Even if the UAE means it as such, it's certainly going to give many people pause for thought. Would you feel happy going to the UAE to conduct research at the moment? No,
I certainly wouldn't. And I know a number of my colleagues, many of whom study the Gulf in various disciplines, also feel the same way. They are feeling increasingly reluctant about going to the United Arab Emirates. And as you said, the intention here isn't important. Regardless of whether Matthew is released, and I think he will be, he's still been in prison for 5 to 6 months, much of which has been in solitary confinement in appalling conditions without proper due process. So regardless of whether this is resolved in a way that is a best possible outcome now, he has still had to endure psychological trauma for such a large amount of time that is enough to intimidate anyone wishing to do research on the UAE, whether they're an academic or even a journalist.
I mean, the UAE's got a number of foreign universities or links to foreign universities, hasn't
Absolutely.
it? I mean, it seemed to have encouraged academic freedoms.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about the United Arab Emirates is prior to the Matthew Hedges issues blowing up, for example, Birmingham University in the UK was opening a campus. Now those people in Birmingham are going to walk out in protest against the creation of a Birmingham campus because of Matthew Hedges, although prior to that, they were also concerned that the rights of LGBT students wouldn't be guaranteed because of the national laws in that country. So there have been these tensions before between Western universities and the United Arab Emirates, and there have been other issues where free speech or the lack of free speech has been criticised on these campuses. So it is a delicate issue for, New York University, for example, NYU, and then obviously Birmingham, about how they negotiate their relationship with countries that obviously don't adhere to the same standards of academic freedom.
Radha, do you share the optimism of Mark that Hedges will be released? Are the signs pointing towards that?
It seems, in my experience, that when there is so much international press pressure, there's certainly concern amongst the private sector and the governments in the UK, in the United States and our allies. I think that the UAE really has no choice but to reach a diplomatic solution, and hopefully Hedges will be home soon. Just touching on freedom there, I mean, his academic research is akin to a journalist and freedom of speech. The UAE ranks extremely low in the annual rankings of freedom of press. And most journalists who work in the country are unable to ask questions that could be considered in any way detrimental to the country. And the same goes for researchers. So it's certainly sending a message that the UAE is much more strict than we would imagine our ally to be.
Fascinating, very interesting indeed. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us for the discussion today. Mark Owen-Jones, Glenmore Traynor Harvey and Radha Stirling. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.